So I spend my day thinking of ways and really actively doing the ways that I believe can push things forward every single day, even if it's just a little bit. If you don't have those tools in your toolbox right now, let's start
Mm.
there. Let's start with who you are before you start worrying about everything around you.
Joining me today is Michael Rubin, and he is a high school principal. So, Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Appreciate you having me.
Of course. Let's go ahead and get started. Michael, can you explain what a high school principal does?
Oh gosh, depends on the day, depends on the minute.
Okay.
I think, there are a lot of perceptions around what a principal does, and I think it is pretty context dependent.
Okay.
And that means both time and place. I mean, in the school that I work in, I have the latitude to do a lot of instructional work. I have a
Okay.
lot of opportunities to work directly with teachers because of the size of my school, on setting strategy and working on things that I believe are important for teaching and learning. But there are some
Mhm.
schools where the job is far more administrative, and if not, um, more, I would say, human resources, facilities,
Okay.
budgetary involved. I work in a small school. There's about 600
Mm.
students. So
Wow.
in a school like ours, and I've said this to some others that are in the profession, uh, being a principal means that you don't get to choose the challenge that comes across your desk.
Mm.
It means that you are tasked with setting the course and keeping things on course, regardless
Yeah.
of what challenges that institution or your
Mhm.
staff or your students face.
Yeah. And what made you want to get into this career path, and how did you get your start in
I
it?
probably have one of the unique paths towards becoming an
Okay.
educator. I was never an education major. I never student taught. I
Okay.
found my way into a classroom and never really left. I mean, I always say I've been institutionalized since the age of 3. So why not stay there forever? But in all
Right.
seriousness, the opportunity at the school where I was teaching presented itself for me to move into the assistant principalship. And I had been teaching for 5 years. I was, by most accounts, fairly young,
Okay.
being 20, I think 7 years old, and being
Mhm.
thrust into an assistant principalship was it's in and of itself a challenge.
Yeah.
Um, but I became a principal because, the opportunity for me to engage with as many students and colleagues that I can,
Mm.
and have a broader impact was really kind of a challenge that I embraced and wanted to embrace. The other part of being a principal that I think is, philosophically, probably a positive for me getting into
Mhm.
it at 27 years old. And after 5 years is I left still very much loving the classroom.
Okay.
And you sometimes hear from school leaders who say things like, "Oh, I'm just ready to not be teaching anymore." I never had one of those days. I
Okay.
still have not had one of those days. And I think, having that deep appreciation and love for the work that happens day to day
Mhm.
between teacher and student is actually what motivated me to move into administration, because being
Okay.
able to leverage that across an entire school is pretty exciting.
Yeah. And what parts of your job are the most exciting or the most interesting to you?
Um, when I get to work with a staff member that maybe is facing a challenge, or something instructional or not, something
Mhm.
emotional, and helping them, seeing the light in their eyes when that opportunity, when they have that moment of clarity, or that moment of success, uh
Mm.
that's pretty awesome. When you see a student who comes across the stage and the story that's etched into that diploma is
Mm.
really exciting for me to be able to do for hundreds of kids every year.
Yeah.
um and honestly, there are, some people would say that the job of the principal, I really believe that it is seen in the success of others. It's,
Mm.
Yes, I work in a school where, I've had some, positive acclaim, or our school has had positive acclaim, and it's a testament to the people in the building because I
Mhm.
don't teach those kids every single day.
Yeah. And on the flip side, is there anything that you think might be harder, emotionally challenging, or maybe boring, not so fun?
Well, nothing's really boring. I mean, I have to admit, there are some things that some principals hate that I love, like scheduling or
Okay.
something like that,
Okay.
like the budget. But to answer the frustration or the
Mhm.
challenging part, um, there are more problems that face us that for which there is no playbook and there is no
Okay.
textbook and there is no
Yeah.
frame of reference. It's new, it's unique, and you're talking about someone's life. We're
Hmm.
talking about like kids' lives in these situations. And
Yeah.
not having solutions for students that are in some social emotional crisis, having a parent sitting in front of you and knowing that there's pain and there's anger, and they may be putting that towards me, and disconnecting from that to say, I know this isn't about me, and I know this is about whatever the situation is, but not always being able to have an immediate solution in a world where we are used to being able to Google answers. Uh,
Yeah.
that's frustrating, and it's hard to sometimes navigate.
Yeah. And do you think that people expect you to have a solution right away?
Sometimes yes. There used to be a lot more uh, patience and grace with
Mhm.
comments like, "I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you, but I'll get one." Um,
Right.
that seems to be something when people come in and they want to, they want instant gratification. I think that's a societal sort of challenge we're navigating. If you break your pair of glasses, you ordered something on Amazon and it might show up the next day, or
Yeah.
you run out of something at your house, you go curbside pick up at Target,
Hmm.
and you have it in 2 hours.
Absolutely.
That's not always the case when you're talking
Yeah.
about credit recovery. It's not always the case when you're talking about a student who maybe has been chronically absent. It's not always the case when you have a staff member who needs to improve and you're working through the nuances of a plan that might take a few months.
Mm. Okay. And what do you think are some other things that people might underestimate or overestimate about your job?
I don't think they quite understand how ubiquitous the presence of things like cell phones and
Okay.
technology. Like, we're conducting this interview at 6:30 p.m. local in
Hmm.
my house, and that's not unusual for me to be
Okay.
working at 6:30 p.m. at my house.
Okay.
Um, but if tomorrow were a school day, I would still be there at 6:30 in the morning. And these jobs aren't 24/7, but some people, I think, underestimate how 24/7 they can sometimes be. And I'm not complaining.
Okay.
Believe me, I'm
Mhm.
not. Um, because that's the job. Like, that's the opportunity.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes what we face. On the flip side, I think sometimes people think that during the general school day, if nobody naughty gets sent to the office, then the principal doesn't have a lot to do. And quite
Mhm.
honestly, we've been talking for 10 minutes or so, 8, 9 minutes, and I haven't mentioned discipline. I haven't even mentioned the concept of like
Sure.
dealing with misbehaving students. And
Yeah.
so some people may think that's a big part of our job, but if you have a
Mhm.
really good culture and solid instruction, and your staff is keeping kids engaged, that's not an issue.
Yeah. Okay. Amazing. And now we're going to go into a little bit of the industry and what that looks like. What are some niches that someone can choose to specialize in, if there are any?
So the thing about school leadership is I'm in a public school, I'm in a public suburban school. And when I
Okay.
mention context, I have a good friend who's a principal of a very, very urban high school.
Okay.
95% of the students who go to his school show up every day by foot or by taking public transit.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Okay.
the whereas if you're in a suburban school, half the kids
Hmm.
might get dropped off by mom and dad.
Yeah.
Those are some of the contextual, sort of decisions that some people make. I grew up in a city. I'm very comfortable with city schools. I just happen to have
Hmm.
worked in suburban schools and for most of my career. But I also think there's a certain je ne sais quoi, or a certain set of abilities that come that don't necessarily translate to all kinds of schools. There are some people who
Okay.
work really, really well with schools that are suburban, affluent districts where parents are very, very involved. There are some people who work very, very well in schools that are. I'm a high school principal that where you're dealing with elementary and early literacy versus high
Mm-hmm.
school, which is like sort of the what are we doing to set these students up for life
Yeah.
beyond the public school experience. All of those are some of the decisions that people make. I've seen people that are very successful in public schools not
Mm-hmm.
do well in private schools and vice
Right.
versa. I've also seen people that were really truly outstanding elementary principals, and then an opportunity comes for them to move into a middle level or a high school level, and they're just as successful. And I think that really has to do with the person,
Mm-hmm.
and their ability to lead more than the context. But I talk about that all the time. That time and place and
Okay.
can really be the real driving force between being a successful leader or not.
Yeah. Yeah. And how did you choose, or have you always been in a public high school, and how did you choose that that was for you?
I've always been a public school person. Both of my brothers
Okay.
went to private high schools.
Okay.
I did apply at the time to be a teacher at a couple of private schools, but
Hmm.
quite honestly, it really wasn't me. I
Okay.
went to a pretty, I guess people would say a pretty elite, competitive, whatever you want to call it, undergraduate
Hmm.
experience. It's not that there was anything wrong with the private school experience.
Hmm.
It just wasn't me. It just wasn't,
Okay.
in my code, I guess, or my
Okay.
destiny.
Yeah. Okay. So now from Google, the average salary for a principal is around $109,000 a year. From your experience, do you think that's accurate? What do you think about that number?
Uh, for Massachusetts, that's low.
Okay.
Um, you said 109, so I mean that's
Hmm.
low. But when you get to other states, it is not particularly low.
Okay.
Um, the
Yeah.
the challenge that when you hear that number, the challenge that the profession is facing, is that um, you can be a teacher in a state like Massachusetts or Connecticut, and you can approach
Hmm.
that 100 to 105, $110,000
Wow.
salary as a
Okay.
teacher without
Hmm.
all of the headaches and responsibilities that come from leadership. So leadership in a school is not often a financial decision. I could tell you that when I was a fifth
Okay.
year teacher and I moved from being a fifth year teacher to a first year assistant principal, there was a nice
Hmm.
pay jump. Um, but if I were a 10th or a 15th year teacher moving over, there might not be.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense. And so now, what are some current trends or challenges in this industry, and how do you see it changing in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh, well, now you get me on my soapbox because so one of the roles I wear as a high school principal is I'm our state coordinator for the national organization. And the
Okay.
National Association of Secondary School Principals has a lot of data that's showing that not only the number of educators going into the profession is dropping, but then the number of
Mhm.
educators who are then moving into leadership is dropping. And the
Okay.
number of people that are leaving the profession is greater than those who are going in. So from a simple supply and demand standpoint, there is more demand than supply
Okay.
for adequate, competent educators. A couple
Okay.
of years ago, and this is an anecdote we use when we're lobbying for the cause in
Hmm.
Washington, D.C. A couple of years ago, there was a school not too far from where I work here in Massachusetts where the district needed a high school principal. They posted for the position, they got no applicants. They reposted for the position, they got no applicants. They then moved
Wow.
somebody internally into the principalship, and within 3 or 4 months, that person said, "This isn't what I want." And then they
Okay.
reposted it. They got 3 applicants. Now,
Okay.
20, 25 years ago, that job probably gets 30, 40, 50 applicants. It maybe doesn't get
Wow.
100. There are some districts that will still get 100 applicants,
Hmm.
depending on time and what time of year and what their salary structure is like.
Yeah.
But that is a trend that is very, very real. And
Okay.
I have been saying that, in the, 80s and 90s, if you were a teacher and you had tenure, you weren't out there actively looking for new positions.
Mhm.
But the era of what I call free agency, where teachers can explore and can be out there because there's so much more of a again demand than there is supply in some disciplines,
Mhm.
has made it really challenging. Now, as from a school leadership standpoint, the challenges of when you put in the used to again you used to just think of like okay, budget, curriculum,
Mhm.
data, sort of the day-to-day operations of a
Yeah.
school, and now you start throwing in hiring, you start throwing in some of the gaps that people have in terms of social emotional support systems,
Sure.
you throw in some of the politics that are out there regarding education and how
Mhm.
divisive some people make education in a community one way or the other. I'm, not
Yeah.
advocating one perspective over another. I tend to be
Mhm.
one of those, all perspectives matter.
Yeah.
Those sort of things are just deterring people from going into the profession. And I think that's a turnaround that's going to be a little hard for us to negotiate.
Okay. And so you see that kind of sticking around for a little bit until,
Yeah, I don't see it going away that
okay.
quickly, particularly in some of the states where um, the there's some talk about making principals elected positions. That makes me a little bit anxious
Mhm.
about what you're beholden to, because at least as a principal right now, I'm beholden to a superintendent who is
Mhm.
appointed by a school committee and is an educator. When you
Okay.
get into that sort of realm of public sentiment, does that mean you
Mhm.
lose your job because a majority of voters didn't like a decision you
Yeah.
made? Or that's where this can get really,
Yeah.
really dangerous.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's a
Okay.
concern I have, because that is a trend in some communities.
Okay. Wow. So how do you stay updated with all of the latest developments of the industry in the field?
It helps that, my being the state coordinator means I get a lot of access to
Mm.
meetings that most people aren't on, and I tend to
Okay.
be the conduit to the rest of the administrators in Massachusetts.
Okay.
But the national organization puts out a lot of publications, emails, calls to action. I'm very, what's the word, selective, I guess, about the
Mhm.
social media sources that I try to follow. I tend to get our school involved in organizations that uh, it's have a place of value, and we can learn from each other. And those are some of the people that I will learn directly from,
Yeah.
rather than taking the word of like a third hand party or third party that is perhaps agenda driven. I
Mhm.
tend to be out there exploring things on my own. There are some publications and some reading that I like to do.
Mhm.
There are some books, but more and more I am finding that the interpersonal part of learning information is it's way too easy for us to just text or read a tweet and take it
Yeah.
as, or whatever it's called, a posting on X, and realize like, hey, that's gospel truth. No, I want to be able to go and have an actual conversation with
Yeah.
practitioners. I want to learn from other people.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So now going into your daily work and what your day looks like. I know we touched on this a little bit and how it can vary a lot, but for an overview, what's your schedule like and what tasks do you spend the majority of your day doing?
So on a typical day, my day starts, in the morning with trying to be in sort of a visible place where I can see staff and students.
Okay.
I'm not one of these people who stands there and gives a high five to everybody, but I do like to see people, say good morning. If somebody comes
Yeah.
in, they had a good softball game the day before, or they talk to whoever. I think you can tell, a pretty conversational person. Um, and then I typically try and find 15 or 20 minutes every day to connect with the rest of our leadership team just
Okay.
around what's going on.
Okay.
Um, and by that I mean the assistant principal, the dean of students, the athletic director. And there are, weekly meetings where we're doing more of the
Mhm.
strategic planning, more strategic sessions, but on a day to day, it's very organic. And I believe that we should never be beholden. Building relationships doesn't happen with appointments.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
spend a lot of time in and out of classrooms. I will try to take time to, deal with some of the tedium, but for, that I I only have kids in the building for 5 or 6 hours a day. So if I have
Hmm.
kids in the building for 6.5 hours a day, my responsibility to making sure that that experience is valued is being in the rooms, working with teachers. Um, I will spend, a good chunk of the week, there are a couple of standing meetings that just seem to
Hmm.
happen when you're a principal. You have your
Yeah.
meetings with the other principals or the meeting with the pupil services director. And
Mhm.
I do a fair amount of interacting with our counselors. I'll do a fair amount of interacting with a special ed
Okay.
coordinator. Now, that may not happen all of them on one day. It might be,
Hmm.
today I spent an hour with our building space support team. I'm going to spend a couple of hours building tomorrow I'm going to spend a couple hours working on an agenda for our first couple of crisis team meetings and building out some scenarios that we can respond to. So
Yeah.
while it isn't necessarily everything to the minute planned,
Hmm.
I don't tend to find myself with a lot of idle time. I mean, we're not,
Okay.
I'm not usually sitting around the office playing solitaire, but waiting for something
Hmm.
to come to me.
Yeah. And do you see that there are any busy seasons as part of your job? And if so, what are they?
The stretch between Thanksgiving and Christmas tends to be really challenging for families on a lot of
Hmm.
levels. It tends to be pretty
Okay.
emotional. I've always said that March is a brutal month. It's long. There aren't a lot of breaks in the action. But to me, the part of the year when an administrator, a school principal, is about as busy as it gets, starts around the first or second week of May and ends around the second or third week of June. Everybody else is tapering down because they're getting ready for a
Yeah.
summer vacation, and
Yeah.
we're wrapping up literally everything you can possibly think of. Between
Okay.
writing, this year I had to write, between 50 and 60 educator evaluations.
Mm.
Formative or summative evaluations. There
Hmm.
is graduation to plan. There's scholarship and awards night. There's a prom. There's AP testing, there's state
Yeah.
testing for MCAS, and the day-to-day doesn't stop. And then there's, the occasional difficult conversation about where you are in May or June with staff members who maybe aren't coming back, or you may be hiring for positions that.
Right.
So when you start building all that, that June busy season it is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And on the other side, there really isn't a period of time other than July and maybe the beginning of August where things taper a little bit.
Okay.
Although I think we have done a pretty good job of recognizing when your staff and your kids are escalated or at least have a heightened sense of
Hmm.
whatever energy is going on, nervous energy. So when I see that coming and I sort of feel that pulse, and that goes back to, again, being out of the office. I got to
Yeah.
tell you that there's nothing you can do better for your staff than saying things like, that faculty meeting we were going to have today, we're not going to have. Or,
Mhm.
um, you know, to the staff, hey, look, there's definitely an undercurrent with the kids this week. Let's keep things in mind and
Okay.
remember that when you're assigning, whatever work you're doing this week.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Amazing. And now we're going to go into like the specific skills and what it takes to become a principal. So are certain degrees or certifications truly required to get this job?
Um, Certifications, yes, because that's in Massachusetts, that's a state regulation.
Okay.
I have to be licensed as a school principal,
Principal. Okay.
and I have to maintain a license as a school principal. A
Okay.
lot of ways to get there.
Mhm.
Massachusetts, you can get it like I did. I got a master's degree in educational leadership, and then I got a doctorate
Okay.
in leadership,
Okay.
leadership studies. But some people go through a what's called a certification program where they have some proficiency tasks in which they demonstrate and articulate their performance relative to certain standards of the administrative rubric,
Okay.
and they get a performance evaluation that earns them a licensure. So there are a couple of ways to
Okay.
to go about it. Different states have different requirements,
Hmm.
and then different states have and do not have reciprocity, which is something unique to Massachusetts because we're not reciprocal. You still have to, if you
Okay.
could be a principal for 20 years in Michigan, and if you come to Massachusetts, you still have to pass the
Yeah.
teacher certification test.
Yeah. And how often or how do you even keep your license updated?
I have to relicense every 5 years. Um,
Okay.
and it is it's a 5 year, you maintain a professional development plan and
Okay.
set goals and establish them and document that with the department. Now, it is a little different for administrators than it is for teachers because we don't
Mm.
necessarily have to worry about professional development in pedagogy and
Hmm.
curriculum and instruction, and also in your discipline.
Okay.
Because for us, our discipline for school principals, the discipline is more around level. Like, I'm not certified as an elementary principal, but I am
Okay.
certified as a middle level and a high school principal.
Okay. Amazing. And now, what are some natural strengths or talents that you think would make someone a good high school principal?
So I think there's the authenticity is what I wrote my dissertation on.
Okay.
And there are some core traits of authenticity that I think are incredibly important to any leader.
Mm.
Transparency is one. The ability to process information in a balanced way is two. The ability to have a strong internal moral perspective is three.
Yeah.
And perhaps for me, um, I think there's also a sense of being able to empathize or um, have at least a sense of an emotional IQ.
Mm.
The other skills of leadership, the ability to communicate, the ability to motivate others, the idea that you'll be more transformational than transactional, I
Yeah.
think stem from someone's ability to be real and to be consistent. Um,
Hmm.
I also think there needs to be a sense of respect for the role. I say to people very often that um, ultimately, a lot of the decisions I make, they start and stop with me. Like, the buck has to stop somewhere,
Hmm.
and it stops with me. So no one, and I
Okay.
mean nobody in the building, will be more accountable than me. And I think modeling that sense of accountability is really particularly important in this day and age when it is very easy for people to make excuses for things that don't go well. Something doesn't go
Yeah.
well, I'll be the first one to own it and figure out how we can do a better job the next day. That ability to be reflective is a really critical skill for
Hmm.
for educators in general. But if you're going to be the lead educator of the building, you have
Yeah.
to be able to model that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now, as a high school principal, what do you end up thinking about all day or talking about all day?
Ideally, it's learning.
Mhm.
Ideally, it's the functions of teaching and learning. Um, I often say that the principal's job is to understand that every opportunity, every interaction is an opportunity to move an agenda forward.
Mm.
And if you're in a classroom and you spend a few minutes and you uh, if I'm the principal, I walk into a class and I see something
Mm.
that's substandard and I let it go, I'm doing those students and that staff member a disservice. So I spend my day thinking of ways and really actively doing the ways that I believe can push things forward every single day, even if it's just a little bit.
So now, what tools or technologies do you see that you use a lot as part of your job?
Well, I'm a word processor spreadsheet guy.
Okay.
Although I have a background, this is where I'm maybe again a little different. I have a background in media, so
Oh,
it's
okay.
not unusual for me to do a podcast or to try and do a presentation that's not just
Hmm.
like generic slides with a couple of text boxes.
Okay.
Uh, so I see myself, yes, doing the Google Docs, the sheets, the Word,
Hmm.
the Excel sort of functions, um, video conferencing and the like. but I also like to dabble in some of the things that we're trying to get our students to do, like,
Yeah.
Adobe or, um,
Yeah.
but what I have learned is that I can't know how to use every single form of technology. And it's interesting. I was just facilitating a workshop for school leaders on how to best integrate artificial intelligence.
Mm.
There's a whole lot out there. And I tell
Yeah.
people, if you try to master everything, you will fail. If you can
Yeah.
pick up one or two things that you can do very, very well, you will be fine. Um, I, for example, in 20 something years ago, I learned how to code in HTML and Java. And
Oh,
I could spend my days working on our website that way, but it's a little easier if I had just have a net editor to do it for me.
yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So now we want to give our listeners a little bit of advice. So, what do you recommend that candidates that are interested in this job do to set themselves apart from other candidates?
That's a really awesome question. And it's actually a question that we ask a variation of it on in our interviews. We ask candidates, why you and
Right.
why here? What sets
Yeah.
you apart? Um,
Yeah.
First of all, nothing bothers me more than candidates who walk in having done no research whatsoever on who we are.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
it is far too easy to find information than to ask, sort of those sort of very superficial questions that don't get
Yeah.
to the core of an organization. It,
Yeah.
it, ha, Having a level of preparation is particularly important for me.
Hmm.
And having a level of preparation that is specific to our school or the position to which you're applying. Uh,
Right.
second, second, I think this sounds maybe um contradictory to what I just said, but be
Mm,
curious. Everybody who's sitting in that room around the table is there because they have a genuine interest in whoever is going to fill that next role.
right.
Ask why. Ask
Mm,
questions that say why or how or what motivates you or what are ask some questions that get to the core of the people. Not
yeah.
just a question like, so do you have opportunities for us to supervise extracurricular activities? Of course
Yeah.
we do. Every school has extracurricular activities. Are there opportunities for me to collaborate with others? Yes, of course there are. But
Mm,
what opportunity, when you start getting into the, how can I contribute to a team in my first year? What are some expectations that you have of me as a first year teacher that you would
mm,
want me to keep in mind? Uh, you know, those sort of things would set a person apart. And of course, if we're
yeah.
talking about a principalship, I remember asking the question. I said, there are four different stakeholder groups around the table.
Mm,
There's, students, there's staff members, there's a couple of parents, there's a central office administrator. You all have different needs in mind.
right.
So if I were to ask each of you, what are your priorities for this person to know? Oh, and maybe after, say, 6 weeks on the job, what would they be? And I know that was a question that differentiated me as opposed
Right.
to, so tell me a little bit about the process.
So, if someone wants to make a pivot from another career into this one, what's the fastest way that they can get their foot in the door?
They have to get in the door.
Okay.
There are so many people who are career changers that walk in, they haven't been in a classroom. Get into a classroom, observe,
Okay.
register
Okay.
for a course that's going to teach you the X's and O's if you don't have them. If you have really great instincts for being being in a classroom, working with students, working with
Hmm.
colleagues, being whatever it may be, leverage what your strengths are, and be very honest about your challenges.
Okay.
I think sometimes people are a little gun shy about saying, well, I have or haven't done this.
Yeah.
Um, I think being honest about that and taking an inventory before you walk into that interview is particularly important because it shows that you are a reflective practitioner, that you
Hmm.
are going to be willing to change, that you understand the challenges both in front of you personally and facing perhaps an entire organization.
Yeah. And what are some books, resources, or programs that you recommend our listeners look into if they're interested in this?
So it's interesting. There are a whole lot of books that are in the education space that are,
Hmm.
there are certain authors that I swear by. For example, I really like the work of Michael Fullan. I think
Okay.
his work is, and there's some great work by people like Jimmy Casas about, and Simon Snizik about just leadership and culture in general.
Okay.
But textbooks will only get you so far. In my second year, and I just recommended this to um, a principal colleague of mine. It's actually sitting right here. I just
Mm.
happen to have it. There's a book here called Multipliers. It's by Liz Wiseman. She's a business professor, but it talks
Okay.
about multiplying capacity of people instead of just saying
Okay.
like, let's just add to this, like just add a person to a challenge.
Mhm.
Good to Great by Jim Collins isn't necessarily written originally for an educational audience, but there are some points to that are really,
Mm.
you know, really helpful for somebody who's making
Yeah.
a pivot from business to education. And I remember saying to a novice teacher I had a few years ago, he had had classroom management problems in his previous district, and he went out and he like bought all these books about classroom management. And I
Mm.
said, stop reading the books about how to manage a classroom, and just start reading books about how you're going to find your voice. Because
Right.
once you find your voice, you won't have to worry about discipline.
Mhm.
Yes, a book like Lost at School by Ross Brooks is great. And it's going to help you understand like the perspective of kids who come to school and feel like they don't have a place.
Mm.
But if you don't have those tools in your toolbox right now, let's start
Mm.
there. Let's start with who you are before you start worrying about everything around you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great advice. But now, if you could talk to your younger self when you were just getting started in your career, what advice would you give him?
Oh boy, I'll tell you, 22-year-old me needed to listen better.
Okay.
There were some people, I had some really good mentors, and I had some people that were mentors to me that I probably didn't realize were trying to be mentors to me.
Okay.
If I had just tightened things up a little bit, things a little bit more formal in those early years, I think that may have made some of my professional decisions
Mm.
maybe a little bit easier. Um,
Okay.
but I'm also someone who hasn't bounced around to a lot of places. So I think the other thing that I would tell younger me, because I would have had a more of a foundation, is on more the idea of being comfortable with A, delegation, and B, letting some things go. I tend to be
Okay.
one of those people that perseverates on things. And even after they're in the past, I sometimes will like wonder, gee, was that the right decision? Should I do this? Should I
Mm.
do that? Especially things that maybe aren't in my control. That is
Mhm.
something that I think I would tell younger me to recognize as a challenge I have much
Yeah.
earlier in life.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. Well, Michael, thank you again for joining me on today's episode and for sharing all of your experience with us.
It has been a pleasure anytime. Thank you.
You just got one episode closer to learning about the world of jobs out there. To explore the rest of our career categories and find your best fit, go to jobdictionary.com to sign up for the beta users waitlist. Then subscribe here to find the next episodes coming out this week. And as always, drop us a comment, review, or message to let us know how we can better attune our episodes to your specific needs. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, X, Threads, Pinterest, and wherever else you're on socials to go get our short, snappy preview reels that expose you to new job options every day. Because here at Job Dictionary, we believe your big aha moment can be just one scroll away. Go check it out and get out there. Cheers!